The goal of all of these lectures together is to create a new sphere, to integrate the insights of all the major world's religions and philosophies into one whole, where the mind, the human mind, is active and consciously aware of itself and its powers. The human mind, the theory is that it's based on the human condition, that it's the result of the evolutionary process. Consciousness, human consciousness, is the product of evolution. It's emerged from our development, the evolution of sensation, perception, imagination, memory, and experience, and then we make this big leap from recognizing regularities in experience to art and science, to understanding the underlying causes, and understanding that we are a thinking being in a universe that can be understood, and our destiny is to seek to understand it. When that faculty is directed toward the non-human world, as in the case of the pre-Socratics, that's theoretical nous, and when the mind is directed toward the human sphere, toward self-knowledge and knowing how to act and understanding human emotions, that's practical mind. The goal of practical mind is to embody the truth, to live the truth, to basically evolve yourself as a human being, and while you're evolving and developing your own capacities to understand the universe, to understand human culture, to understand the better and the worse, you're literally creating reality. Your human culture is an emergence of another kind of evolution. The best cultures are integrated with nature, just like the best souls have integrity. The integration of desire, choice, action, and all for the right reason in the right way. The pre-Socratics were focused on theoretical mind, and the next group of videos is going to focus on practical mind, how to educate the human soul so that the inner life is a microcosm in the macrocosm. It presents a system of education based on our discovery that there are universal patterns or structures very deep inside of the human psyche that are the result of evolution, and those powers can be activated in a way that leads to human integrity, and that they have to be activated in order for a person to really live an integrated life. The goal of an integrated life is a combination of the balancing of all these forces inside of us that have also evolved because of their relationship to what is outside of us. And we need to balance those drives, like Aristotle's mean between extremes, and because those basic drives are balanced, we then can evolve toward higher and higher levels of complexity, which are higher and higher capacities we have to interact with each other and with the universe because of our capacity to understand. Okay, so Aristotle's virtues, just to remind you, he gives you a theoretical explanation, a series of definitions of the powers of the soul that exist in us potentially because of our place in the universe, and we activate them through the way we live and the kind of pleasure and pain we feel by what we do and what we choose. So self-control is the virtue in relationship to the natural drive for eating, drinking, sex. Courage is hitting the mean, acting appropriately in relationship to situations of fear, which are perfectly natural since our condition is one of vulnerability. But if we have courage, we can respond appropriately and minimize how vulnerable we are. If we overreact, we simply make ourselves more vulnerable. Generosity is our helping each other, developing a high quality of community where we have goodwill and trust toward each other, which is, we are social and political beings by nature, so we need each other and we need to deliberately behave in ways that demonstrate concern for each other and promote each other's well-being. Even temperedness is situations of anger, ambition, pride. All of those emerge because of our social and political nature. Finally, at the highest level of interpersonal relationships, we have living together under a body of laws, political association. So the capacity of human beings to recognize this natural need in order to achieve really high levels of development and create an ordered society, we need to agree on what laws are promote the common good for everybody in the society, and know how to make good laws, and know how to distribute wealth and social goods like education, healthcare. People are unequal in their needs for these social goods, and a good ruler, a person is exercising political power well when they figure out how to distribute those collective goods in a way that promotes well-being. Then there's the rectification of wrongs when somebody disrupts the equilibrium, how to punish in a way that promotes the common good. And so Aristotle defines all those virtues, and he says that virtue is not a set of definitions, it's a way of life. And it's a way of life where your emotions are mature. You want to do what's just, and your mind is mature. You have a good understanding of how to deliberate, how to evaluate what's best in a situation, what the options are. You're good at picking the best option and understanding the reason for it, and then you're good at persuading other people to actually agree with you. Now, the images in mythology and archetypal images, that's what I'm going to talk about next. And the world's mythological tradition has recognized these patterns in human affairs. There are common agreements between these traditions about better and worse ways to live. And the goal underlying all of these traditions is that we would become a microcosm in the macrocosm, both as individuals, as members of families, as members of communities, and as members of political entities, and in our relationship to other people who belong to other political associations. Okay, and the goal, the reason to try and achieve this goal is that the wise person is best fitted. There's the most integration between the individual, the culture, and nature. And that's the society and the person that's going to flourish. And the more you aim for that goal, the more likely it is you will pass on a legacy of a better world for your children and your grandchildren. Now, another theme of these lectures is that the Enlightenment philosophy and worldview has been replaced since Einstein and quantum physics, and that replacement is quite a bit, has a lot of similarities with ancient traditions. So, that Carl Jung, I'm going to quote in this first lecture quite a bit from Carl Jung, because he was one of the earlier intellectuals who recognized the value of myth. During the Enlightenment, mythology was taken to mean false attempts to understand the universe, and that science has now replaced. And so myth is associated with false, and scientific knowledge is true, and never the twain shall meet. And Jung said, no, that's not true. Actually, mythology is trying to educate the psyche and the collective unconscious for the good life. And the Enlightenment view of reason is going to lead to disaster, because all it does is deny and repress the fact that we have evolved from previous forms of animal life. So we still have a very animalistic side to us. It's part of our psyche. It's most deeply rooted. It's the most primitive side, but you can't repress it or deny it. You have to educate it. And he was the founder of what's called Archetypal psychology, a movement in psychology. So I'm going to start out with his criticism of modern rationalism and then get into his claims. First, he says, modern man does not understand how much his rationalism, which has destroyed his capacity to respond to numinous symbols and ideas, which are mythological religious symbols and ideas, has put him at the mercy of the psychic underworld. He has freed himself from so-called superstition, but in the process he has lost his spiritual values to a positively dangerous degree. His moral and spiritual tradition has disintegrated, and he's now paying the price for this breakup in worldwide disorientation and dissociation. In human beings, the animal being, which lives in him as his instinctual psyche, may become dangerous if it is not recognized and integrated into life. Human beings are the only creature with the power to control instinct by their own will, but they're also able to suppress, distort, and wound it. And an animal, to speak metaphorically, is never so wild and dangerous as when it is wounded. Suppressed and wounded instincts are the dangers threatening civilized man. So, this dark side that we have is, for most of us, unconscious. And the purpose of mythological education is to awaken, activate that unconscious, get us to recognize these drives deep inside of us, and also to recognize some of them, many of them, are very aggressive and dangerous. They have to get flushed out. But also we have a natural drive to understand. So we have this also deeply rooted desire to live for the sake of something greater than ourselves, to pass on a better world, to gain knowledge and wisdom, and create the common good that we can pass on to our children. So he says, all known vices are the negative, dark aspects of the unconscious, which can manifest itself in two ways. In the positive sense, the unconscious appears as a spirit of nature, creatively animating human beings, things, and the world. In the negative sense, the unconscious, the same spirit, manifests itself as a spirit of evil, as a drive to destroy. So the idea here is that there is this, the unconscious is the source of our greatest creativity and our greatest destructiveness, but it has to be recognized and understood. Jung talks about, because of evolution over time, the deepest part of our collective, of our unconscious, this process, is something we inherited. He says, we also find in the unconscious qualities that are not individually acquired, but are inherited, that is, instincts as impulses to carry out actions from necessity without conscious motivation. In this deep stratum, we also find the archetypes. The instincts and archetypes together form the collective unconscious. And so we have our immediate consciousness, in which case all of us are completely different. This was what the Enlightenment, if we are born a blank slate and we have some genetic traits, but most of what we are is a product of the environment. And Enlightenment thinkers thought that, and they thought if we develop social science enough, we can treat people like silly putty, we can mold them like clay, and we can make them all humane and nice and friendly to each other. And Jung and the mythological tradition, and I will say the Greeks, think that no, that's not the way you do it. You have to flush out all the crud and all the aspirations deep inside the unconscious, recognize your whole psyche, and then realize that those destructive impulses are really self-destructive. You don't really want them, so that you really desire wisdom. Okay, so in addition to our immediate consciousness, which is of a thoroughly personal nature and which we believe to be the only empirical psyche, there exists a second psychic system of a collective, universal, and impersonal nature, which is identical in all individuals. This collective unconscious does not develop individually, but is inherited. Okay, so we have it. It's a product of evolution. So it's not sort of some abstract a priori structure like Kant said. It's a product of evolution, and yet we inherit it. It consists of pre-existent forms, the archetypes, which can only become conscious secondarily, and which give definite form to certain psychic contents. To the extent that the archetypes intervene in the shaping of conscious contents by regulating, modifying, and motivating them, they act like the instincts. It is therefore very natural to suppose that these factors are connected with the instincts, and to inquire whether the typical situational patterns which these collective form principles apparently represent are not in the end identical with the instinctual patterns, namely with the patterns of behavior. So when we start getting into the stories of myth, Greek myth and tragedy in Homer, you could see more clearly that these represent patterns of behavior that people inherit, and some of them are positive and some are negative. And so you have to educate people so that they channel these deeply rooted patterns. They realize the ones they don't want to follow, and also recognize the ones that they do want to follow, and then they start molding themselves consciously. But first they have to understand what's rooted in the unconscious, and then they can start to know themselves and to flush out the unconscious and be more creative, channel the drives toward creativity. The collective unconscious is not to be thought of as a self-subsistent entity. It's no more than a potentiality handed down to us from primordial times in the specific form of mimetic images, or inherited in the anatomical structure of the brain. They are not inborn ideas, but there are inborn possibilities of ideas that set bounds to even the boldest fantasy. So Aristotle's model of the virtues and practical wisdom are what we have the potentiality for, given the human condition. How we activate that potentiality, how we use those capacities, inform them into a whole way of life and the kind of person that we become. This is the big issue. This is what mythological traditions are trying to educate you about. So, Jung says, essentially, mythological figures give form to countless typical experiences of our ancestors. They present a picture of psychic life in the average, divided up and projected into the manifold figures of the mythological pantheon. The impact of an archetype, whether it takes the form of immediate experience or is expressed through the spoken word, stirs us because it summons up a voice that's stronger than our own. Whoever speaks in primordial images speaks with 1,000 voices. He enthralls and overpowers, while at the same time he lifts the ideas he is seeking to express out of the occasional and the transitory into the realm of the ever-enduring. He transmits our personal destiny into the destiny of humankind, and evokes in us all those beneficent forces that ever and anon have enabled humanity to find a refuge from every peril and to outlive the longest night. Okay, now this is the way Hesiod describes himself, that he's sitting up there on the mountaintop, and all of a sudden the muses become active, and they speak to him through the laurel tree, right? He's greater than himself. He's outside of himself. He's speaking in this voice of humankind. He's speaking in the voice of the human condition. He's no longer himself. He's bigger than life. And if the person who listens to him, okay, Zeus on Olympus listens to him, because the forces of equilibrium and evolution that are built into the natural world are also limiting conditions for human beings and human culture. And if we don't follow that, those powers in nature, or sitting on Olympus, will come back to haunt us. But also remember, the human ruler who is wise, he also listens to these stories that Hesiod tells, or the artists tell. The artists of every tradition tell these stories and is happy. The voice of the muses makes him happy because he can realize that he's learning the lessons. He's not going to make the mistakes. He understands why other people do what they do, and he can bring mind, practical mind, into being. He can make it incarnated in the way he makes judgments and his education of the population through a combination of the way he lives and his ability to explain it, to inspire people, and to explain to people how they ought to live. Then Jung distinguishes between great art and trivial art. Okay, there's art that just talks about the immediate. It might get to experience, but it doesn't understand those underlying, really deeply seated causes. So, but the art that really touches the unconscious and triggers deep hidden drives inside of us that we can identify with. We get outside of ourselves. Suddenly we see ourselves as part of the human condition. Everyone who's ever lived has felt this way or been in this situation. This is great art. He says the works, the way the artist works when he's creating these kinds of works, the works positively force themselves upon the author. His hand is seized. And he's talking about written works. Of course, I'm talking about oral. The mythological tradition started out oral. His pen writes things that his mind contemplates with amazement. The works bring with it its own form. He can only obey the apparently alien impulse within him and follow where it leads, sensing that his work is greater than himself, and wields a power which is not his and which he cannot command. Here the artist is not identical with the process of creation. He is aware that he is subordinate to his work or stands outside it, as though he were a second person, or as though a person other than himself had fallen within the magic circle of an alien will. And again, that sounds like he's outside of himself. And then Jung goes on in a way that is similar to Aristotle. Aristotle said that the theory of ethics and politics can't make people virtuous, because virtue is based on your desires, that you have to be emotionally mature. But if you are emotionally mature, learning the system and the causes behind it and all the different virtues and how they relate can be very helpful. So the same with Jung. He says, the mythological figures are themselves products of creative fancy and still have to be translated into conceptual language. Only the beginnings of such a language exist, but once the necessary concepts are created, they could give us an abstract scientific understanding of the unconscious processes that lie at the roots of the primordial images. In each of these images there is a little piece of human psychology and human fate, a remnant of the joys and sorrows that have been repeated countless times in our ancestral history, and on the average follow ever the same course. Okay, and then he says, so he's trying to give a more theoretical understanding of the mythological tradition, and he tries to do it by really affirming the language of myth. It's the only way to educate. Just like Aristotle said, it's a theoretical language is intellectual. It's not going to move you emotionally or in terms of action. Jung says, it's possible to describe this content of the unconscious in rational scientific language, but in this way one entirely fails to express its living character. Therefore, in describing the living processes of the psyche, I deliberately and consciously give preference to a dramatic, mythological way of thinking and speaking, because this is not only more expressive, but also more exact than an abstract scientific terminology. It is only possible to live the fullest life when we are in harmony with these symbols. Wisdom is a return to them. It is a question neither of belief nor of knowledge, but of the agreement of our thinking with the primordial images of the unconscious. They are the unthinkable matrices of all our thoughts, no matter what our conscious mind may cogitate. And again, that's the whole theme of my lectures, is this integration of the universe with the human psyche to create wisdom, or to actually promote human flourishing. It's not created, it's kind of creative, and it's kind of just recognized. You're just becoming completely human. Then Jung also does the following. Jung is offering the critics a justification for a truer, fuller, more accurate and adequate interpretation of symbolic works by establishing a psychological theory in which intuition has an understandable role to play or purpose to fulfill. For culture, just as for therapy, symbols are not intuitions by themselves. They are only the brute facts that have to be interpreted. Herein lies the inestimable importance of the critical enterprise. Without the correct conscious interpretation, the symbol remains only an uncomprehended event. With the correct interpretation, it can become a living experience, contributing to the betterment of the patient in one case and of the society in the other. And of course, that's what I want to do in these lectures, is to speak um, about how the mythological tradition, the tradition of tragedy, how all these aspects of Greek culture really do speak to us. We need them. We need to hear the lessons that they want to teach. And so I'm being the mediator. I'm trying to awaken people's awareness that this isn't just false and it isn't just old. It's really very contemporary and cutting edge, given relativity physics, quantum mechanics, and what we also know about the evolution of the human psyche. Finally, he says, Jung says, these archetypal images belong to humanity at large and can crop up spontaneously in anybody's head at any time and place. The suitable moment for this is always when a particular view of the world is collapsing, sweeping away all the formulas that purported to offer final answers to the great problems of life. And in this particular point in history, as Laszlo and many others say, the Enlightenment view is dead, and we are now, it's leading us into complete self-destruction. So we have to stop, and we have to reconsider, and we have to find a way to integrate with nature. And this is going to take a lot of effort, because we've molded ourselves in a lot of ways unconsciously for many centuries. And we have to break through this kind of superficial patterns of behavior and get down closer to the collective unconscious and find a way to recreate culture from a very deep level in order to preserve ourselves. So the next few lectures are about how the Enlightenment view emphasized what's mythologically projected as male energies. Females have these energies, but they tend to dominate in the male, and they were associated with male domination. And we have to balance out our culture. We have to reimagine, re-envision, and also reawaken the female source, the nurturing, the great goddess. So that's what the next few lectures are about, is the balancing or the reemergence of nurturing powers that don't try to control nature, but try to recognize that we live within a context of cycles that have a natural equilibrium, and we have to stop disrupting that equilibrium.